Hello, Bob. We're back with the six black presidents, black blood, white masks. Moving on to Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson, seventh president, U.S.A. Andrew Jackson was the seventh president of the United States. He served as president from March 4th, 1829 to March 3rd, 1837. Jackson said that his position as President of the United States was a situation of dignified slavery. Birth questions. Andrew Jackson was born March 15th, 1767, on the settlement of Old Warhol, the border of North and South Carolina. His mother and father were said to have been very poor immigrants from Ireland. Their birth dates are not known. Jackson was the third child in a family of three children. Some historical documents state that Andrew Jackson Sr. was not the biological father of Andrew Jackson. Jackson's supposed father, Andrew Jackson Sr., died before Jackson was born, and is said to have been conceived after the senior's death. It is said that the father of Andrew Jackson was an African slave. Rogers also writes that the Virginia Magazine of History, Volume 29, page 191, says that Andrew Jackson was the son of a white female who had intermarried with a black man, and that Jackson's oldest brother had been sold into slavery in Carolina. Rogers points out that what gives an air of truth to this was that Jackson Sr. died before Andrew was born, and that his widow went to live on her sister's farm, Mrs. William Crawford, where there were many male African slaves or political prisoners, and that one of these men was the father of Andrew Jackson. Jackson felt defenseless when the tabloids attacked his ancestry. One newspaper article read, General Jackson's mother was a common prostitute, Jesus, brought to this country by the British soldiers. She afterward married a mulatto man with whom she had several children, of which General Jackson is one. In David Whitney's book, The American President, it is stated that Andrew Jackson Sr. died only a few days before Andrew's birth. Coit states that Jackson Sr. died a few days after the younger Jackson was born. And Schlesinger, Jackson, page 23, states that Andrew Jackson's father died 1 month before his birth. The literature on this subject is very scarce, giving credence to wonder and speculation. There isn't even a specific day or date as to when Jackson Sr. died, and Andrew Jackson did have many living relatives who should have known. The reader should note that most of Andrew Jackson's known relatives were from his maternal side. Youth. During Jackson's young years on the farm with his mother and brother, Jackson is said to remember days when he would read newspapers to the whole community. Some historians state that Jackson especially remembered reading the words of Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence when a copy of that document first reached Waxhaw in the summer of 1776. Andrew Jackson was 9 years old at the time. Rimini states in his book that this is a nice story, but very untrue. He said that some overzealous historian added this to his writings to enhance the tales of Jackson's life story. Nonetheless, neither of these mulattoes, Jefferson nor Jackson, realized that he would one day be the President of the United States. Jackson grew up a poorly educated orphan, but he was a fast, non-traditional learner who fought as a boy militiaman in the Revolutionary War. He also squandered away a small inheritance as a teenager, then finally settled down enough to become a lawyer. One of the main psychological forces in Jackson's life was his unmitigated hate for the British. Good man. His mother used to tell horror stories to Jackson and his brothers about the suffering the family endured under British rule in Ireland. In the spring of 1780, during the American Revolution, these feelings of hate and revenge were escalated. Jackson had once refused to polish a British soldier's boots. The soldier attacked Andrew Jackson, with a sword. Jackson raised his hand so that the sword would not cut his face. His hand was slashed to the bone. He was to carry these mental and physical scars with him for the rest of his life. Andrew was 13, or maybe 12 at the time. His brother Hugh died, an 18-year-old soldier, in 1780 from heat exhaustion. His brother Robert died the same year at age 15 from a very high fever. Jackson's mother died in 1781 of cholera. Her last words to Andrew before she left to care for American soldiers were, "None will respect you more than you respect yourself. Avoid quarrels as long as you can, but sustain your manhood always. The law offers no remedy for such outrage that can satisfy the feelings of a true man." As stated earlier, historian Joel A. Rogers mentions in his writing that one of Andrew Jackson's brothers was sold into slavery. Another account of the brother sold into slavery story can be found in David C. Coyle's Ordeal of the Presidency. The research deduced on this particular subject has not corresponded with this particular story as being fact. But with the many inclusions and exclusions in history, who knows? It could possibly be true. Lawyer. 7 years after the death of his mother in 1787, Andrew Jackson was admitted to the bar to practice law in Salisbury, North Carolina. During his student years, he was said to be absolutely wild. Many Salisbury residents were shocked years later when they heard that this barbaric-type boy was running for the presidency of the United States. One Salisbury woman said, "Well, if Andrew Jackson can be president, anybody can." Attorney Andrew Jackson moved to Nashville, Tennessee in 1788. He was a boarder in a home of a socially prominent widow by the name of Mrs. Rachel Stockley Donaldson. Mrs. Stockley Donaldson had a married daughter by the name of Rachel Donaldson Robards. She was married to an insanely jealous lawyer by the name of Lewis Robards. Andrew Jackson fell in love with this married woman immediately. Different from Thomas Jefferson and his married women relationships, Andrew Jackson would eventually marry Rachel. A rough marriage. Andrew Jackson had a tough enough childhood and teenage life without the headache of what was to become after he was finally married at age 24 to the feisty, intelligent lady Rachel Donaldson, minus the Robards. They were married in 1791. Rachel, at age 18, had married Lewis Robards, who was from a so-called good family. It was later discovered that Robards was mentally ill. After Rachel and Lewis were married, Lewis would sometimes go into insane rages accusing Rachel of flirting with men when she really had not. I mean, she absconded with Jackson, so. In one case, she had only suffered some man a glass of water, but Rachel was flirtatious on some occasions. Robards' insaneness got to be too much for Rachel. She thought it best to leave him for her own sanity and good. She left Robards more than once. She always went back to him. By age 23, she finally left him for good. She was also dating attorney Andrew Jackson by this time. She finally divorced Lewis Robards, so Rachel and Jackson thought. After Rachel and Jackson were married, they discovered 3 years later that Robards never filed the divorce papers. The papers were null and void. It is rather strange that Jackson, who was now a lawyer himself, did not check into the detailed technical legalities of his wife's divorce papers, especially since the mental faculties of her ex-husband, were questionable. Robards then sued Rachel for divorce, stating that she was still his wife, and saying that Rachel was a prostitute sleeping with another man. This upset the Jacksons very much. Andrew Jackson stated that he would not marry Rachel again just to appease society, because in his eyes, he and Rachel were really married, and he loved her. But he finally consented, and they had another wedding, yet smaller than the first. From this point on, the media had a field day with the Jacksons. During Black Blood, during the Jackson years, tabloids were widespread about Jackson's black blood and his wife, the prostitute. They said that Andrew Jackson had stolen another man's wife directly from his bosom. The Jacksons' true friends and Rachel's family knew better. They knew that Robards was an insanely jealous man who himself had committed adultery while still married to Rachel. Robards' affair was with one of his political imprisoned African black female slaves. Old history literature indicates that this type of behavior for white males was not a social taboo. It was not considered rape or adulterous. Many white women went into jealous rages, but they were not in positions to do anything else. Murderers. In May of 1805, the now socially prominent Andrew Jackson brought into the Jacksons' prosperous home the distinguished murderer and former Vice President of the United States, Aaron Burr. Burr slayed mulatto Alexander Hamilton in 1804. Afterwards, Burr was wined and dined in many socially elite settings as a hero for killing Alexander Hamilton. I mean, they did have a duel, he just didn't murder him. Westerners held duels in high esteem. They did not hold Hamilton as high. It seems that it was appropriate conduct to invite Burr types into the Jackson home, since Jackson is destined to be such a murderer himself. The years between 1812 and 1817, Jackson will slaughter and kill many Indians and Africans. 1 year after Burr's social visit to the Jackson home, Jackson also killed a man. His name was Charles Dickinson. It is said that Dickinson had made verbal slurs about his beloved Rachel and her alleged prostitutism. Jackson would later defend the political friend whose wife was being dishonored in the media also. In 1815, when the British and the Americans were fighting on the west bank of the Rodriguez Canal, 2,057 British soldiers lay dead and only 13 Americans. All of the Americans were black. These African men fighting for Americans, barely free of course, were put on the front line. Jackson said of these African men that they were so anxious for glory that they could not be prevented from advancing over our breastworks and exposing themselves. They fought like desperados. With the shackles of slavery in mind, it is a possibility that some of these brothers may have gone overboard in their efforts to appease the master, and it is also just as equally a grand possibility that while these men fought on the front line, the white soldiers stood by laughing and watching them die. For men such as these blacks, all one white man had to do was yell, "Get down." But living in an America such as it was then, many of the black men probably knew exactly what they were doing. It was just like jumping over the ship rails during the Middle Passage. But no matter what, Jackson still thought them stupid and understood perfectly well why these African men might do such a thing, trying to please massa. Please, readers, do note that the Webster Dictionary defines a desperado as a bold and reckless criminal. Why did Jackson say that these men fought like desperados? But during the War of 1812, some Africans had fought so superbly and gallantly that Jackson could not help but commend them. Daniel Webster, another note, Daniel Webster, who was a statesman and an acquaintance of Jefferson's and Jackson's, was also known to have had black blood. A white acquaintance of Daniel Webster's before Webster became famous saw Daniel Webster one day and exclaimed, "What, that little black stable boy that once brought me the horses?" Daniel Webster was known as Black Dan. It is said that Webster was so dark that a General Butler in a letter to Stanton, who was Secretary of War, likened Webster to the black race. In September 1862 letter to Stanton, Butler wrote, "I shall have within a few days a regiment 1,000 strong of native guards, colored, the darkest of whom will be about the complexion of the late Mr. Webster." A rage in Jackson. Andrew Jackson was not a fan of George Washington. He said that George Washington should be impeached for signing the treaty with England. Jackson was a man who hated the British, Indians, blacks, whites, and this research in psychohistory shows that he seemed to have hated himself to a certain degree. Well, at least he was consistent. It can be deduced from the literature, however, that Jackson did love his wife Rachel. With his biological family gone, her love and her family were very much needed to keep him as mentally stable as possible. He is said to have loved children in his normal frame of mind. Jackson's frame of mind was not only questioned by John Adams, but also by Thomas Jefferson. Although Jackson and Jefferson had their differences, they both still had to make their public appearances. In the spring of 1815, Thomas Jefferson was a guest at Jackson's Hermitage home. Jefferson was now 72 years of age and traveled all the way from his Monticello home. of which he shared with his African mistress, Sally Hemings, to join in the tribute to the slaughter hero. When Jefferson was asked to give a toast to Jackson, he said, "Honor and gratitude to those who have filled the measure of their country's honor." From the political history gathered about Jefferson's feelings towards Jackson, the statement Jefferson made bordered toward sarcasm. Several years before this occasion, these two men had met at a conference. Jefferson was then Vice President of the United States and was presiding over a federal government conference. Jefferson noted that every time Jackson would rise to speak, Jackson would become so choked with rage he could not say one word. Thomas Jefferson decided that the young Senator Jackson was a passionate and dangerous person. Forrest McDonald remarked on a recent television special, 1991, that Jackson sought the approval of the rebel, the common man. In 1813, Jackson had savagely assaulted another community of Indians, burning villages, plundering their food, and killing. He systematically slaughtered these Indians in Talushatches, Talushatches. After this horrible massacre, Jackson found a dead Indian mother still clutching her baby. He asked some sad-haired Indian women to take the child. Remini tells the story like this: "All of his relations are dead. They, the Indian women, said, 'Kill him too.' The general rejected this solution and afterward took the boy, named Lincoln back to the Hermitage and provided him with every advantage, including a good education." Any reader can conclude from this statement how some historians write to make white political criminals sound like the nicest, kindest, most honorable people in the world. Historical biographer Margaret Coit goes further by stating that Jackson was tender and gentle. Look and listen to the statement. General rejected this solution. A white supremacist personality. I can't do anything you ask. Who do you think you are? These feeling women knew how to keep the child alive at least a little longer. They were mourning their own and probably thought that a savage like Jackson was bound to kill them in a few moments anyway. Historian Robert V. Remini stated that when Andrew Jackson hated, it often became grand passion. He could resort to petty and vindictive acts to nurture his hatred and keep it bright and strong and ferocious. Lincoln lived a short life of 17 years. It's difficult to stay alive living among your enemy. Even the youngest children can feel it. Thomas Jefferson felt the same, living with a mother who held an attitude of superiority toward her own son. Lincoln died of tuberculosis and perhaps mental anguish. Jackson made a statement during one of his political speeches in reference to Indians. What good man would prefer a country covered with forests and ranged by a few thousand savages? Did he really feel any different toward Lincoln? I guess we'll find out in the next segment, Blacks and Indians. Goodbye, bruv. Goodbye.